Until I was about 25, I lived in a beach town. My specific neighborhood was about a 20-minute walk from the beach. Around 80% of my personality was beach-related. I've been surfing longer than I've been able to speak, and it would be unusual for me to shake out a pair of shoes without some amount of sand falling out. My two best friends, let's call them Armin and Chuck, were extroverted, outgoing, and charismatic. We were all 18 and very much obsessed with girls. It was a Saturday night in late May, just a few weeks before school let out. Senioritis had long since set in, and at this point my friends and I regularly pushed the limits of what we could get away with without getting in trouble. We already had our co-ed college acceptances, so we didn't really care much about high school anymore. Armin and I had plans to meet up with two girls from our high school that we'd been getting along with really well. The plan was to pick them up in the evening and enjoy a cool, breezy night on the beach. We had blankets and a few bottles of wine, the perfect combination for stargazing. I don't condone drinking and driving in any capacity, but I was just a stupid kid. I arrived at Sophia's house just after 9. She and her friend sort of walk-danced to the car, making it clear that they had something to drink beforehand. Armin and I exchanged excited grins. It was going to be a fun night. I took a scenic route to a secluded beach about a 30-minute drive away. The whole time, the four of us were having a great time, cracking jokes and talking about mutual friends. At one point, Fran and I had a deep philosophical conversation about the nature of time and death. We were all very much enjoying each other's company. The specific beach I chose had a dirt path that you could drive up. From there, a narrow sand path led to the beach. The path was pretty steep, but I picked it because we were less likely to encounter other people at such a secluded spot. Furthermore, this beach was far from the main boardwalk, so the sky would be clearer for stargazing. I thought of everything. I parked my car as far up the dirt road as possible, and the four of us hopped out. Armin and I carried the blankets and wine. I'll fast forward through the boring stuff. After a few hours and an empty bottle, Armin and I found ourselves separating. He and Fran walked up the beach, while Sophia and I walked in the opposite direction. After being separated by a decent amount of distance and darkness, I threw my blanket down, and we drunkenly fell asleep on it. Before anything happened, Sophia tensed up. At first, I thought it was something I had done, but then she whispered, "Do you hear that?" I focused my attention and strained my ears, trying to hear something other than the gentle crashing of ocean waves. I assumed she was just drunk, but then to my surprise, I did hear something. It sounded almost like a whirring noise, like the sound a small engine would make. The sound seemed to move around, and I couldn't pin down where it was coming from. Then it seemed to fade away into nothingness. "It's nothing," I assured her, eager to resume what we had been doing. Soon after, I fished my shirt from the sand and shook it out before throwing it over my head. Just then, Sophia, who was still lying on the blanket, shrieked. I whipped around to look at her and saw she was pointing up at something. I looked up but couldn't see anything besides the blackness of the sky. I sat down next to her to get a better angle and was horrified. From her point of view, the moon was perfectly aligned with what appeared to be a drone floating directly overhead. It hovered a little while longer before zipping up into the dark sky and disappearing out of sight. It all made sense. The noise we had heard before was 100% the drone. I got angry at myself for not realizing it at the time. I then got sick at the thought of being watched that entire time. I glanced over at Sophia and could tell she had the same exact feeling. She put her head in her hands and started crying. I consoled her as best I could before suggesting we walk back to the car. The two of us made it to the car to find Armin and Fran already there. I quickly explained the situation. The two of them were dumbfounded, and I could feel the joy in the air literally being sucked out. I began driving in silence in the direction of Sophia's house, eventually trying to lighten the mood with some conversation. It didn't work, though. The girls agreed that they didn't feel safe going home just yet. It was a Saturday night, so I didn't mind staying out late. I asked if we could hang out at either of their houses. They both shook their heads, saying their parents wouldn't allow it. My house was off the table for the same reason, as was Armin's. I decided to ask Armin to call up Chuck, which he did. Chuck's house was massive, and his parents were super chill. It was honestly the perfect spot. To our delight, Chuck was free. I pulled into Chuck's driveway and parked the car. Armin and the two girls began making their way towards Chuck's front door, and I told them I'd catch up to them in a second. I needed a moment to think about everything that had just happened. I was more shaken up than I was letting on, so I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes in an attempt to calm down a bit. Honestly, those few seconds with my eyes closed really helped. Instinctively, I pulled out my phone, which I hadn't even touched since the incident. The screen lit up, and I stared at the single notification that sat on the display. I had to blink a few times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. My entire body froze as I stared in horror at the lone notification AirTag found moving with you. Every emotion that I had just expelled from my body came crashing back. We were literally being tracked. I snapped out of my paralysis and jumped out of the car, examining every inch of the vehicle. Nothing on the front bumper, nothing in the grille, nothing on the back. I started getting desperate, checking the seats and flipping floor mats. Still nothing. By now, sweat was pouring down my neck, and I could feel the hairs on my arms and legs standing up. I got on my hands and knees and began examining the underside of my car. I got to the tire on the driver's side and began feeling around the tire well, and there it was. It was literally taped to the underside of the well, impossible to find if you didn't know what you were looking for. I held the tag in my hand for a few seconds before throwing it to the ground and smashing it to pieces. Whoever had watched us on the beach with that drone knew where we were. I didn't feel safe in Chuck's driveway all alone. I picked up one of the broken AirTag pieces and ran over to Chuck's front door. I told everyone what I had discovered, showing them the AirTag pieces to prove it. They were even more horrified than I was, especially the girls. They checked their phones and saw the same notification. Chuck was particularly pissed off because we had potentially tracked back to his house. After the panic subsided, we spent the rest of the night in Chuck's basement and ended up sleeping over. A couple of weeks passed and nothing happened. Honestly, my friends and I were glad to forget about the whole thing, assuming it was entirely in the past. The only way we could rationalize it was that some creep wanted to watch some young adults hook up on the beach and track their car to scare them. It was chilling to think about, but we were relieved that the situation hadn't escalated. One Sunday morning, about 3 weeks after the incident, I got a call from Chuck. He screamed through the phone for me to drive to his house as soon as possible, which I did. When I got there, he was standing in his driveway with a concerned look on his face and some papers in his hand. I was confused until I realized what he was holding. They weren't papers, but rather pictures. I examined them more closely, pictures of me from that night on the beach. They were grainy and dimly lit, but you could clearly see Sophia and me in revealing fashion. I was disgusted. I could only imagine how Sophia would feel upon finding out. Not knowing what to do, we called the police and explained the situation. They told us that there was essentially nothing they could do, but we insisted that they at least scan the photos for prints. They eventually got back to us saying the photos turned up nothing. Sophia was terrified that whoever sent them would try and blackmail her, and I feared the same. The experience was downright traumatizing. Luckily, nothing ever happened after that, probably because we had gotten the police involved. Sophia was never quite the same around me after what happened, and I can't blame her. I can only hope those pictures don't turn up later in my life.